Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks that he is wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is folly before God. From 1 Corinthians. Folly is a condition which prevents that which is true from being grasped. From Plato. Consciousness succumbs all too easily to unconscious influences, and these are often truer and wiser than our conscious thinking. Personality need not imply consciousness. It can just as easily be dormant or sleeping. From C.G. Jung, Conscious, Unconscious, and Individuation. All right, welcome back, friends. Now to letter 21. We're getting to the end here. The Fool, from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. And as you know, the Fool is unnumbered. So, and as Tomberg admits right up front, it's almost arbitrary that he placed it here, but it's not arbitrary. It has a reason, right before the final card, the World. Another place he could have put it would be before the Magician, which is kind of a traditional setting. And there are different authors on the tarot will place the Fool in different places. But in general, the point is the Fool travels through the cards. I remember when I first started studying the tarot back, I was probably 18, 19. And I dreamt I was the Fool, basically. I didn't realize at the time, but essentially I was the Fool walking through the major arcana. And that's, look, he's on a journey, right? He's kind of just oblivious to what's around him. And I think a great archetype, if we will, of the Fool is Parsifal from both Chrétien and Wolfram von Eschenbach's treatment of the Grail story. Because he starts off, he is dumb. And he has no idea how to be a knight, but his destiny is to become this great knight who finds the Holy Grail. But between the way the story starts and the story ends, he does a lot of maturing and gains a lot of insight, like we all do, right? This is why I'm not too happy with the Comte de Graal hero of Galahad, who starts out perfect and ends perfect. I can identify more with Parsifal. He starts off as a rustic and a bumpkin and ends up as a humble initiate into the mysteries of the Grail. He knows he doesn't deserve it. He did it by trial and error, like all of us do. But I'm digressing. And he says here, Tomberg does in the beginning, that gives his principal reason for placing this card here. The principal reason is that the meditation on the Arcanum, the Fool, cannot conclude the series of meditations on the major arcana of the tarot. For the meditation on the Arcanum, the Fool, as a spiritual exercise, is not of a nature to summarize the whole preceding series of 21 meditations on the tarot. That is, to play the role of the last point of view of the experience that the symbolism of the tarot renders possible. So that's a good enough reason. But he saved it up, and I think there are other reasons he saved it up for almost last, and we'll get there. But notice, in a way, this letter, as all of the letters as we progress through, recapitulate themes that were visited earlier. And this one of the things he recapitulates here and opens up more is more about the circle that he had been involved with studying tarot in St. Petersburg before he left Russia. And he must have been a teenager, 17 years old or so, when he was part of this group. And he names names this time. He names Professor Gregory Antonovich Mebes as the leader of this group at Page's College in St. Petersburg, right? And he apparently met them right after the Bolshevik Revolution. So he's a young person and initiated into this circle. And he does this, I mean, first of all, to share with us that in that group, they corresponded the fool with the Hebrew letter Shin from the Shekinah, right? And also, it was added that the esoteric name of the arcanum of the fool is Amor, love, right? So, and then as he says, and I think it's a beautiful gesture, and because he admits that, you know, after he left them, he developed his own thoughts and insights about the tarot. But he is not without gratitude. And he says, toward the bottom of 591, it is the matter, therefore, beyond the two reasons concerning the scope of meditative work on the tarot and the significance of the number 21, of putting a memorial wreath on the non-existent tomb of the group of St. Petersburg esotericists from the beginning of this century. You know, he's lighting a candle in their memory. And I think that's a beautiful gesture. Very beautiful gesture. And then he's describing what a fool is in history. You know, the fool that the tarot represents. I mean, we all encounter fools every day. But he said, you know, he uses Don Quixote as an exemplar, an archetype of this fool. Everybody laughs at him, but he's onto noble business. And he says here, where did it go? On page 592. Right? It is your voice which resounded more loudly than the beating of drums around the guillotine one day in the month of Thermidor or Fructidor in the year 2 or 3 of the French Republic calendar. With a cry from the top of the scaffolding, "Long live the king!" There's a fool move for you. Before your chopped off head rolled to the ground. It is you also, in the presence of the jubilant revolutionary populace, tore down from the wall and ripped up a red placard announcing to the people of St. Petersburg the dawn of a new era in Russia, and it was promptly run through by the bayonets of Red Guards present. It is you again who declared openly to the German military authorities of the invaded and occupied Netherlands in 1941 that Germany, by occupying the land, was infringing the Hague Conventions that Germany herself had signed 30 years previously. And actually, we've mentioned it before, but it was around this time that when the Germans annexed the Netherlands that I can't remember the name of the archbishop who denounced them, but after this Dutch archbishop denounced the Nazis, the Nazis went, you know, up the ante, and they decided they would grab all of the Jews who had converted. So anyone with Jewish blood, who even if they were practicing Catholics, would be now sent to the concentration camps. And this is the move that ensured St. Edith Stein would go to the gas chamber. May her memory be eternal. Right? So he's celebrating this kind of foolishness, foolishness on behalf of truth. Right? And then I think it's you can tell how important Jung's thought was to Tomberg, and especially in this letter, because he goes through a list of archetypes that are so living, and that because the tarot are more than symbolism, he says, even more than spiritual exercises, they are magical entities, active initiating archetypes. And then in this strain, he mentions Orpheus, the Wandering Jew, Don Juan, and Till Eulenspiel, which those are funny stories. And then he finally gets to Faust, right? As archetypes that an archetype. In fact, Faust he sees as the archetype most characteristic of his times, and I would say of our times as well. And he also mentioned, this is an interesting place, and I don't think I've heard this or heard about this any place else than in this book, when he's talking about the sailors of the Baltic Fleet. This is on page 595, who supported the October Revolution, but then they saw what would happen with it. You know, they rejected it. You know, they fought for it, and then they saw what happened. And this, as you know, this is an important moment in our understanding of rebellion, or foolishness, as we saw with those the figures he mentioned from the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. And here, he says, now watch. So what they desired, meaning the sailors, was the reestablishment of the community of comrades which existed in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, known under the name of, I'm never going to pronounce that, the Cossacks of the Ukraine, the ideal of the communist anarchist community. Right? However, in 1921, they realized that they had been mistaken. It was not a community of brothers and comrades which arose from the October Revolution, but rather state control with a new, strong, dictatorial, police-regulated state, governed by a clique who had the say of everything in the face of the mass, who had the say of nothing. That's a warning, right? It's a warning to us as well. It's a warning to us as well. Brotherhood doesn't happen from the top down. You can't do brotherhood by gunpoint or by threat. And then he talks about Kierkegaard and existentialism, but then he gets to Faust, which is I really want to talk about right now. Now he says he compares Faust to Job, but if you notice, because they both stories start the same way. Job starts with Satan asking God if he can take everything away from Job and see if he still loves God. And then Faust gets the opposite. Faust gets everything given to him. He gets spoiled, and see if he'll curse God, right? And he says, Faust is Job in the epoch of humanism. This is at the bottom of 596. Faust's trial and temptation differs from that of the biblical Job in that it does not consist in the reverse of fortune and in ill luck, but rather in favorable results and success, right? And he goes a little further. He mentions Oswald Spengler in his book, The Decline of the West, and Spengler calls modern man Faustian man. Now, I remember this, I probably was a teenager, maybe it was even in high school, watching a documentary about the scientists who developed the atom bomb or the hydrogen bomb. And one of the scientists even described it himself as a Faustian bargain, right? They're tempted with the promise of all this knowledge and power, and they went for it. And, when they saw what happened, with Oppenheimer, I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. And my son, when he made his first communion or profession of faith, and he was 7, probably, our pastor gave him this beautiful wooden cross that kind of a really unique pattern on it, and it was carved and wood burned, and on the back of it had a number, in the 3000s, I think, and our pastor told him that this was actually made by one of the scientists from the Manhattan Project who, after he saw what they did, as penance, made these crosses. So this was the Faustian bargain. Look what you unleashed. And then when people say, oh, but it can be used for energy and good, tell Fukushima that. Tell Fukushima. And this is what we have to contend with. And it's not just in science, in that kind of power. As Tomberg says here in 597, it is just as if the prince of this world has obtained full power to satisfy one after the other all the desires of contemporary mankind, so as to demonstrate for himself that the power and enjoyment of the relative and transitory world here below can make man forget the absolute and eternal, can make him forget God. That's right. The trial of our epoch is that of Faust. It is the trial of satisfied desires. Just look at the internet. You know, you can listen to music. You don't have to pay for music to listen to it. You can get books for free. You can watch a lot of movies for free. You know, nobody wants to pay for anything, you know. But it's not just that. It's just all available and readily available. And we just inundate ourselves with entertainment, information, arguing on Facebook, whatever it happens to be, you know. And he continues. I'm going to read the whole paragraph here. The most recent phenomenon of our epoch is communism. Oh, he was writing this in the 60s. Or, if you wish, social and collective state control. It openly pursues the aim of satisfying as completely as possible the needs and desires of as large a number of people living on Earth as possible. Well, let us suppose that it succeeds in Russia. Everyone will have well-furnished accommodation with a telephone, a radio, television set, refrigerator, a washing machine. And what then? Yes, cinema, theater, concerts, ballet, sport. And what then? Yes, science will furnish new occasions and directions for activity, for the imagination, and for desire. One will visit the moon, the planets. What then? Elon Musk? There will be unparalleled adventures to experience and to know about, which as yet we cannot imagine, as, for example, the discovery of the existence of other intelligent beings, other mankinds on the planets. And what then? No answer. No, there certainly is an answer, he says. It is given by the parable of the prodigal son. What is the value of television sets, washing machines, supersonic aircraft, spaceships, flights to the planets, and galactic exploration in comparison with the loving embrace of the father upon the return of his son to the parental home? The trial of our time is that of satisfied desires. This applies not only to communists, capitalists, and materialists, but also, and no less so, to, I shall not say esotericists, but occultists and magicians, for they are also under the sign of the same trial. Right? This is one of his themes, right? The desire for power. And so many people you see in these circles, I mean, that's why they're there. You know, whether it's compensation from psychological wounds as children or whatever, it could be a lot of things. And those things could lead people into seeking security and knowledge and to know God, right? But, you know, it's a two-edged sword. I mean, there's that, but there's also, wow, look what I can do. So it's so dangerous. And then he gives a few examples of Lévi, Saint-Martin, who else does he give? Paul Sédir and Pappas. You know, these figures who not rejected, but transcended the esoteric path by finding the ceremonial path. And he also points to Saint Cyprian, right? Which I had, you know, it's a fascinating story with Saint Cyprian, right? All these people who renounced, and Cyprian, I mean, he probably made most modern day occultists or magicians look like they're playing with toys, you know, with the things he knew. But he renounced the wisdom of this world to give himself up to the wisdom of divine love, which is folly in the eyes of the sages of this world. And I know I mentioned it before, but a great book on magic and how it actually relates to our own time is Ioan Koulianos' Eros and Renaissance Magic. Check it out if you would. It's a worthy read. And then he goes back to another one of his themes, and he sees this in the Fool. He sees part of it in the Fool. The Arcanum, the Fool, teaches the know-how of passing from intellectuality, moved by the desire for knowledge, to the higher knowledge due to love. Right? Can be considered a fool. In fact, I would have to, you know, I know it when I left kind of that esoteric past behind me and became a practicing Catholic. A lot of people just thought I'd lost my marbles, or I regressed, which is the same thing. You can see Tomberg says that Blavatsky said about Lévi, for instance. It's typical. It's typical. But, you know, sometimes you need a higher magic. Right? And he says further, the Fool is related to the transformation of personal consciousness into cosmic consciousness, where the self is no longer the author of the act of consciousness, but is its receiver, obedient to the law of poverty, obedience, and chastity. And but he says it's, there's two sides to this. For on the one hand, it teaches the freedom of transcendental consciousness elevated above the things of this world. And on the other hand, it clearly presents a very impressive warning of the peril that this elevation comprises: lack of concern, inadequacy, irresponsibility, and ridicule. In a word, madness. It teaches transcendental consciousness and it warns of its peril. Right? And he says, and I just apologize for so much reading. For the intellect can be, this is page 604, for the intellect can be sacrificed in two different ways. It can be placed in the service of transcendental consciousness, or it can be simply abandoned. Hermeticism chooses the first way, right? It's not a rejection of the intellect. It's a transcendence. And if it's abandoned, it's not abandoned in a kind of, it's not abandoned, it's maybe left behind is a way to talk about it. It's not still intellectual, but you intellectual. The intellect is the ladder on which you get there in a way. But then you have to let go of that tool, right? It's a tool. Think of it as a tool. And this is what he says. In the passing beyond the intellect, it is a matter of choosing between the decision to replace the intellect and once and for all with the breath from above, and the decision to place the intellect in the active service of this breath, whether it produces ecstatic raptures or not. And the danger, of course, is, he mentions elsewhere, I can't remember what letter it is, you become a spiritual drunkard, right? If you're just there for the vibe, I'm there for the esoteric feels. That's what's the difference between Hermeticism and that kind of path, which we see lots of people like that in the world. They're there for the feels. They're there for the outfits. They're for the stuff. Kind of spiritual materialism. Back in the 80s, it was crystals, right? You just have, you have your esoteric swag. And you probably have decorations in your house of the Tree of Life or whatever. You don't need to do that. You don't need to do it. Verily, they've already received their reward. And then, so this is leads him back into a discussion of scholasticism, which I don't want to revisit. We've talked about it quite a bit. And how scholasticism for him, does just this. It's the intellect leading you to the experience of the transcendent, right? Is exemplified in Thomas Aquinas. Oh, there goes my cat. All right. And we're probably the heart of this letter, and the reason I think he saved it till this point, is when he gets into this discussion of avatars and the Maitreya Buddha, right? And remember, he set this up in the last letter when he talked about announced incarnations versus hereditary incarnations, the usual path, right? And he says, where are we at? And he mentions it. So the letter awaits. He's talking about Buddhas and avatars. The latter awaits both a new wave of revelation, the culminating point of which will be the Kalki avatar. And we talked about the Kalki avatar before. And the manifestation of a new Buddha, the Maitreya Buddha. At the same time, and he talks esoteric Islam, talks about the coming of the 12th Imam. Of course, Jews wait for the Messiah, and Christians await the coming of the second coming of Christ. And he says, and this is an interesting point, there is a climate of expectation in the world. Expectation sustained, contemplated, and intensified through the course of the centuries. Without being nourished and directed from above, this energy of human expectation alone would have exhausted itself long ago. And then I think it's a nice that he brings Aurobindo into the conversation. And even though he disagrees with Aurobindo's conclusions about Jesus as an avatar and about Buddha as an avatar, because Buddha's not an avatar. He's a self-made man in a way, right? It's an enlightenment from below. There's nothing divine in him. He rose to the divine. He did not incarnate as divine. Unlike Christ, Krishna is the other example. And Krishna is the only real example of an avatar, because Christ is in a whole different category. So that's what he's talking about. But what he's really getting at is this idea of the Buddha to come, right? And he talks about, you might know about it, might not know about it, the Order of the Star of the East by the Theosophists in the early decades of the 20th century, where they were trying to present Krishnamurti as the new world teacher, the new Christ, right? And they tried to enlist Rudolf Steiner in this, and Rudolf Steiner said, sorry, not going to play. They wanted him to be John the Baptist, and he cashed in his chips and started his own thing. But there was still this idea of a world teacher appearing, which Steiner, talked about. And this is what Tomberg says on page 614. It was more discreetly, and without putting a particular person in the limelight as a candidate, that Dr. Rudolf Steiner, founder of the Anthroposophical Society, predicted the manifestation, again in the first half of the 20th century, not of the new Maitreya Buddha or Kalki avatar, but rather of the Bodhisattva, that is, the individuality in the process of becoming the next Buddha, whose field of activity he hoped the Anthroposophical Society would serve. A new disappointment. This time the disappointment was due not to an error with regard to the awaited individuality, nor even with regard to the time of the beginning of his activity, but rather to an overestimation of the Anthroposophical Society on the part of its founder. Thus nothing became of it. Right? Now for Tomberg, as you know, he sees the Kalki avatar and the Maitreya Buddha being united as one, right? In a single personality. And he says on page 614 as well, the Buddha avatar to come will not only speak of the good, but he will speak the good. He will not merely teach the way of salvation, but he will advance the course of this way. He will not be solely a witness of the divine and spiritual world, but he will make human beings into authentic witnesses of this world. He will not simply explain the profound meaning of revelation, but he will bring human beings themselves to attain to the illuminating experience of revelation, of a kind that it will not be he who will win authority, but rather he who is the true light that enlightens every man coming into the world. From John. Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh, who is the way, the truth, and the life. Right? Now, before I go into the rest of what he has to say about this, here's what happened with this. The anthroposophists, in general, not individual anthroposophists, I think, but as a group egregore, I suppose, they don't like anybody disagreeing with anything Rudolf Steiner said or criticizing Rudolf Steiner. Furthermore, they suggest that Tomberg is saying here that Tomberg is the Bodhisattva. And there was a book by Thomas Meyer, and I don't know if I have the book, but I can't find it, called The Bodhisattva Question. And it's It's a horrible. I mean, it's horrible in the way it's just gossip. You know, it's just like Prokofiev's books on Tomberg. It's just, you know, it's a program of discrediting, I suppose, and it's really it's needless too. Plus it's boring. It's boring and it's based on hearsay and gossip, and it's not worth your time. If you can even find it, it's probably hard to find nowadays. So yeah, so now, do I think that Tomberg thought that he was the Maitreya Buddha, the Bodhisattva? Maybe he did, but on the other hand, who cares? That's not the point. And I think if you get caught up in that point, you're caught up in gossip and trivia. Because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And he could be right, he could have been wrong. It still doesn't matter. You know? What matters is what he had to actually say about things we could actually use. And here's one of them. You know, now, when he's talking about this Maitreya Kalki, the Buddha avatar, will represent the fusion of prayer and meditation. These two forms of spiritual activity being the motivating forces of spiritual religion and spiritual humanism. Right? The fire of prayer will unite with the limpid water of the peace of meditation. The alchemical marriage of the sun and moon, of fire and water, will take place in him. Right? And then he talks about the history through the Eastern religions as well as Christianity of meditation and prayer. And he points to St. Bonaventure and St. Francis, St. Teresa of John of the Cross, the Mahayana school of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, right? And then he even talks about Ignatius Loyola. And he knows that people don't like St. Ignatius. I don't think it's as big a deal now, but it is within Anthroposophists, boy, when they don't like they what they call Jesuitism. Oh, booga booga. I can't get next to it. In fact, they sound like paranoid Protestants from the 19th century with their complete freak out about the Jesuits. What's wrong with Jesuits? You ever see the movie The Mission? Or what's another movie? Silence, the one Martin Scorsese's recent film. Those Jesuits were heroic in the 17th century. Heroic. And now, and then he points out, and this is, kind of a classic, and if you've ever see a statue of the Maitreya Buddha, even from the East, he's usually seated on a chair like a Western person. So he's thought to be becoming Western Buddha. But does it have to be Tomberg? What does it have to be? Do we have to even think about things like that? Do we have to get caught up in what I think is dangerous Luciferic speculation about people and about who they are or who they weren't? I mean, this is like the nonsense about the 28th Mary Magdalene I've met this lifetime. Just leave that stuff to the side, please. But what's important is this uniting of prayer and meditation that he's talking about. Now, and for him, this is like the next step, I would say, for the Hermeticism, is to unite those two paths. It's the job of the Avatar Maitreya. But it's important. This union of prayer and meditation, and I can't help but think of Thomas Merton or Thomas Keating, who worked so much in the direction of bringing that to our awareness, contemplation. It leads to contemplation. And he says, you can tell his great appreciation for the Kabbalah as a school of meditation. But then he says on page 620, Christian meditation also pursues the aim of deepening the two divine revelations, Holy Scripture and the creation. But it does so above all with a view to awakening a more complete consciousness and appreciation of Jesus Christ's work of redemption. For this reason, it culminates in the contemplation of the 7 stages of the Passion. Right? The meditation of Christian Hermeticism, whose aim is to understand and advance the work of alchemical transformation of spirit, soul, and matter, from the state of primordial purity before the fall to the state after the fall, and from the latter to that of reintegration, the fulfillment of salvation, proceeds, for example, from the 7 days of creation according to Genesis, to the 7 stages of the fall, then to the 7 miracles of St. John's Gospel, and then to the 7 sayings of Jesus concerning himself, in order to conclude with the 7 words of Jesus Christ crucified and the 7 stages of the Passion indicated above. Right? Meditation can thus serve as a means to attain diverse ends, but whatever its aim, it is always the means to realization of a more and more intense awakening of the whole consciousness, and not only of intelligence, with respect to particular facts, ideas, ideals, and lastly, the reality of the human terrestrial and spiritual condition in general. It is also the means of awakening consciousness with respect to revelations from above. To meditate is to deepen. It is to go to the heart of things. Right? And it is this alchemical marriage of prayer and meditation, of the sun and the moon, of the soul's inner heaven, which takes place in the soul of the human being who is in the process of realizing the Arcanum, the Fool. And as he says, the esoteric name of this card is Amor, love. So take these things into consideration. I mean, don't take, esoteric occult gossip into consideration. Take what he says about the path of meditation for the Christian Hermeticist. I mean, that's a lifetime of meditation right there. And it can only deepen your relationship to Christ, which is the point. It's too bad, to digress, but we're going to finish in a second. Very often, I think Rudolf Steiner said in a lecture one time that people will eventually evolve past religion, meaning, that in our moving forward, that we won't need to we will be religion. We will be in communication with God and with each other as a congregation, right? So we won't need to go into the building on Sunday. We will live in a perpetual state of worship, you could say, right? Or of union with the divine. But unfortunately, lots of anthroposophists or people who've read Little Steiner read that and go, oh good, that means I can stop going to church. I'm evolved. That's not the case. And that's what Tom Berg's gift to us is. It says, no. That's not how it works. You need the tradition, right? You need prayer. You need the rosary. Don't think you're being fancy. He talks about the Protestant preaching style, kind of off-the-cuff prayer, which I think can be good. But on the other hand, the idea that you have a prayer book. Well, the prayer book, he says, it's a magical act because people have been using it before you. Even if you say the rosary in a lazy way, it still works. There's still effects from it because you could think about it that part of the spiritual world is moistened, responsive to this, responsive to or accustomed even, you could say, to these prayers that are said. And it doesn't mean you can't bring things to the rosary, right? So the way I say the rosary is probably not like your typical parish says the rosary, but it's pretty close. I've added the invocation of the Mother, Daughter, and the Holy Soul, and I also say the prayer at the end. I say the prayer to the Lady of All Nations, or the Lady of All Nations gave, right? So I say that at the end. But also St. John Paul II contributed another set of mysteries to the Rosary. So it's not static, which is kind of a Hermetic approach to things. It's not static. it keeps breathing, but it's rooted in tradition. So all I ask is just take that into your prayer life and see how that sits with you. And think of Faust. Think of Parsifal. Think of Valentine Tombert. What a fool they must have thought he was. I'll see you next time.